Welcome, the Lord's chosen. The most dangerous weapon isn't a gun or a bomb, it's the mind that learns how to pull invisible triggers. Imagine this. The FBI has entire divisions dedicated to cybercrime, counterterrorism, and organized crime. But the unit they fear activating most, the one that studies people who don't need bullets to win wars, only psychology. Because when you can rearrange the way someone thinks, you don't just beat them, you make them beat themselves. Now here's the unsettling part. You played the game so brilliantly, they don't even know if you're a threat or a teacher. They're sitting in boardrooms with files on your name, not because you left fingerprints, but because you left thoughts they can't unhear. And while they scramble with their official reports, you're probably just sipping coffee somewhere, laughing at how easy it was to make them turn their own paranoia into paperwork. This isn't about power in the usual sense. This is psychological warfare, the kind that turns the world's most powerful institutions into confused chess pieces on a board they didn't even realize you built. And the punchline, you never even broke a law, but you broke their certainty. Number one, you never fought them. You rearranged their minds until they fought themselves. You never fought them. You rearranged their minds until they fought themselves. That's the kind of power people don't notice until it's too late, because it doesn't arrive with noise or drama. It slips in quietly, rewiring the way they see, think, and respond until they are no longer the same person who started the fight. That's why it works so effectively. You never had to lift a hand. You just shifted perspectives, and once that happened, they became their own executioners. The human mind is not built to live with contradictions for too long. If someone says one thing but feels another, if their actions betray the words they cling to, the brain eventually fractures under the pressure. Most people try to avoid that discomfort, but you leaned into it. You fed them truths in doses they couldn't digest, let them stew in half answers, and left gaps wide enough for their paranoia to fill. Suddenly, the story they told themselves no longer matched reality, and once the cracks appeared, they did the rest of the damage on their own. The brilliance of it is that it didn't look like a battle. They didn't even see it happening. They thought they were in control, thought they were leading the chase, but their own overthinking became the leash around their neck. They replayed conversations, reread your words, dissected your actions, trying to find intent you never even voiced. Every time they did, they dug themselves deeper into a maze with no exit. They weren't up against your fists, they were up against their own spiraling thoughts. And thoughts are merciless when they turn predator. That's what real psychological warfare looks like. Not an outward war, but an inward one. By the time they realized, the battlefield wasn't between you and them. It was inside them. They started doubting their instincts, distrusting their allies, second-guessing every decision. And when someone no longer trusts themselves, they're already defeated. You didn't need to win by force. They surrendered piece by piece as their own mind betrayed them. That's the sharp edge of your game. You proved that the greatest victory doesn't come from overpowering others. It comes from making them dismantle themselves while you never even step into the fight. Number two, they called it manipulation because they couldn't admit it was precision. They called it manipulation because they couldn't admit it was precision. That's always the way it goes. When people can't explain how you stay 3 steps ahead, they paint it as some kind of dark trick. But the truth is, there was nothing random about the way you moved. Every word, every silence, every shift in tone was calculated with the kind of accuracy that most people don't even apply to their own lives. And because they couldn't see the structure, they branded it manipulation to make themselves feel safer. What you really did was take the chaos of human behavior and line it up like dominoes. You didn't force them to fall. You just set them close enough that the slightest touch would topple the whole thing. That isn't manipulation. That's knowing patterns better than they know themselves. People forget how predictable they are until someone like you comes along and shows them that their free choices were never free at all. You saw the cracks in their logic, the weak spots in their routines, and you pressed in just enough to remind them that the house they were standing in had no foundation. That level of precision terrifies people because it strips away their excuses. It's easy to call something manipulation when it makes you look powerless, because then the blame shifts. But the reality is harsher. You didn't invent their downfall, you revealed it. You gave them the pieces of themselves they had been avoiding, but you gave it in the exact order that guaranteed they'd trip over it. They weren't beaten by you, they were beaten by their own blind spots. You just knew exactly where to place the mirror. This is what separates manipulation from mastery. Manipulation is messy, desperate, and full of lies. Precision is surgical, clean, and undeniable. That's why it unsettled them so deeply. They couldn't accuse you of inventing anything false, because everything you pointed to was already there. You didn't build a trap. You simply highlighted the one they had been walking through all along. The discomfort wasn't in what you did, it was in the fact that you exposed how little control they actually had. Calling it manipulation was their defense. Calling it precision was your reality. And that reality was sharper than anything they were prepared to face. Number 3, every word you dropped wasn't random. It was a trigger planted like landmines in their brains. Every word you dropped wasn't random. It was a trigger planted like landmines in their brains. That's the difference between casual talk and strategic speech. Most people throw words around carelessly, hoping they land somewhere, but you knew exactly where yours would end up. You weren't just talking, you were programming. Each phrase carried a weight, a hidden charge that didn't explode in the moment, but waited until the right conditions set it off. And when it did, it wasn't just sound anymore. It was an aftershock in their thoughts. This is the essence of psychological warfare. You don't need to raise your voice or dominate a room when you can plant a sentence that replays endlessly in someone's head. A single well-placed remark can grow louder than a shout because it forces the listener to keep returning to it, questioning it, dissecting it. That's why your words had power. They lingered. They weren't meant to win the conversation. They were meant to win the hours, days, and weeks that followed. You didn't push them into decisions directly. You left them haunted by echoes that bent their choices long after you were gone. The brilliance lies in the timing. You never fired those words recklessly. You waited, studied, and released them at moments when they would slip past defenses. They didn't register as threats, just as casual comments or small observations, but beneath the surface they carried sharp hooks. And those hooks dug deeper every time the person tried to pull them out. That's why they couldn't let it go. They thought they were replaying the conversation to analyze you, but really they were analyzing themselves, unraveling piece by piece. That's what made it warfare without confrontation. They never realized you weren't aiming to argue, you were aiming to plant. The battleground wasn't the dialogue, it was the replay in their minds afterward. And when someone's own memory becomes a weapon against them, there's no defense strong enough to shield them. You didn't need to control their bodies, you controlled the soundtrack running in their heads. What unsettled them most wasn't that you spoke, it was that you spoke with surgical accuracy. They realized too late that your words weren't just words, they were silent detonations timed perfectly, leaving them to live in the rubble of their own thoughts. Number 4, they weren't tracking you, they were following their own shadows. They weren't tracking you, they were following their own shadows. That's the irony of the whole chase. They believed they were unraveling your moves, mapping your steps, and tightening their grip, when in truth all they ever uncovered was themselves. The files they built, the reports they stacked, the evidence they thought pointed toward you were nothing more than reflections of their own obsessions and weaknesses. They thought you were the one leaving trails, but it was their fear, their guilt, and their corruption bleeding ink onto every page. In trying to expose you, they revealed how much darkness they carried. Every suspicion they raised said more about their worldview than about your actions. If they accused you of manipulation, it's because they lived manipulating. If they branded you a deceiver, it's because deceit was their own language. What they called investigations were really confessions written in official ink. They couldn't see that they weren't documenting you. They were archiving their own contradictions. This is the quiet genius of your game. You didn't have to defend yourself, you just had to keep moving. Their paranoia did the rest. They mistook shadows for evidence, confusion for strategy, and projection for truth. By the time they thought they had you cornered, all they had was a mirror. They were chasing silhouettes that only existed because of the light you forced them to stand in. And the harder they ran, the bigger those shadows grew, until they could no longer tell the difference between the hunter and the hunted. That's the real sting. They wanted to prove your danger, but all they proved was their own. They wanted to paint you as the threat, but ended up sketching portraits of their corruption in high detail. You didn't expose them. They exposed themselves. And once the shadow is seen for what it is, it can't be unseen. They thought they were writing your story, but the archive is theirs, stamped with every insecurity and sin they tried to hide. In the end, their entire pursuit was never about who you were. It was about what they couldn't face in themselves. They weren't chasing you at all. They were running from their own reflection, and the cruelest part is that it followed them everywhere. Number 5, the real battle was never physical. It was your ability to make them doubt their own certainty. The real battle was never physical. It was your ability to make them doubt their own certainty. That was the sharpest weapon in your arsenal, sharper than any blade, heavier than any bullet. You didn't have to overpower them. You just had to get them to second-guess themselves. Once a person starts questioning their own instincts, they lose the very ground they stand on. They stop trusting their first thought, their gut reaction, and instead spiral into hesitation. And hesitation is where power shifts. This is what most people never understand. Control doesn't come from force, it comes from influence. You didn't bend their bodies, you bent their choices. You didn't restrict their movement, you restricted their confidence. You took the very thing that makes a person effective, certainty, and turned it into quicksand under their feet. They still walked, still moved, still acted, but every step was slower, heavier, burdened with doubt. That's when you knew you had already won. The beauty of it is that you didn't need to lie. You didn't need to shout. All you had to do was raise just enough questions to make them pause. And when someone pauses in a game of strategy, the other player has already advanced. You taught them to hesitate before trusting themselves, and hesitation became a habit. Every choice they made was filtered through, what if I'm wrong? And that question alone rewrote the entire outcome. That's why this battle was never about fists or weapons. It was about faith, the faith people have in their own judgment. Strip that away, and even the most powerful person collapses. They don't need to be defeated. They unravel themselves piece by piece. That's exactly what happened. They began to ask not, what will you do next, but can I even trust myself to respond? And that shift was the final strike. You didn't conquer them by standing taller or hitting harder. You conquered them by making them smaller inside their own heads. You left them trapped in a maze of hesitation, where every decision felt like the wrong one. In the end, you never needed to win the fight, because the moment they lost trust in themselves, they lost everything. Number 6, you weaponized silence by letting their minds invent nightmares you never had to say. You weaponized silence by letting their minds invent nightmares you never had to say. That is the kind of power that doesn't shout, doesn't announce itself, and yet lingers louder than any spoken word. Most people fear confrontation, but what terrifies them more is the unknown. You understood this and turned it into your greatest tool. By withholding what they expected you to reveal, you created a space their own imagination rushed to fill. And the mind always paints horrors far worse than reality. This wasn't about absence. Absence is passive. What you did was suggestion, small gestures, unfinished thoughts, pauses that stretched just long enough to hint at more. You never had to state a threat directly because people fear the possibility of what isn't spoken more than the clarity of what is. In their desperation to decode your silence, they built entire scenarios, each one darker than the last. And those scenarios became cages of their own design. That is how silence becomes a weapon. It doesn't need to act. It provokes. It amplifies. It allows their own paranoia to do the work for you. A single unspoken sentence can replay in their head for days, morphing into something monstrous because there's no limit to how big a threat the mind can imagine. Words have boundaries. Silence has none. That's why it consumed them. They weren't afraid of you directly, they were afraid of the shadows you allowed their own minds to cast. The brilliance of your silence was that it forced them to fight a ghost that didn't exist. They prepared for attacks you never planned, guarded against strategies you never intended, and exhausted themselves defending against illusions of their own making. You didn't have to exhaust your energy, they drained theirs in anticipation. They never realized that their fear was the battle, and the silence you left was the battlefield. In the end, you proved that true power doesn't always come from what is said or done. Sometimes it comes from restraint, from knowing that the loudest noise in the human mind is the echo of its own uncertainty. You didn't need to unleash terror, you simply allowed them to invent it. and that invention became their undoing. Number 7, the FBI doesn't fear criminals, they fear thinkers who bend reality without breaking laws. The FBI doesn't fear criminals, they fear thinkers who bend reality without breaking laws. Criminals are easy to categorize, easy to chase, and easy to punish because they leave behind evidence, patterns, and violations written in black and white. But what terrifies them is someone who plays the game differently, someone who doesn't just avoid breaking laws, but exposes how fragile those laws really are. That's what separates you from the people they usually deal with. You didn't just hide in loopholes, you turned the loopholes into spotlights. You showed them that the systems they swear by are not airtight fortresses, but patchwork illusions held together by trust, obedience, and routine. You moved through the cracks with precision, not to escape detection, but to prove how obvious those cracks were all along. Every move you made wasn't just about survival, it was a statement, a quiet demonstration that the very rules they enforce can be bent, twisted, and outsmarted without ever technically being broken. That kind of exposure cuts deeper than crime because it undermines their authority at the root. The real threat isn't in what you did, it's in what it revealed. If one person can highlight the fragility of the system, others might begin to question it too. And questioning authority is far more dangerous to them than any single act of rebellion. Criminals can be caught, criminals can be punished, but thinkers who bend reality, they create doubt. And doubt spreads like fire, destabilizing the illusion of order they work so hard to maintain. That's why their eyes are on you. Not because you fit the mold of danger they're trained to fight, but because you don't. You refuse to play the game on their terms, yet you keep winning. That makes them uneasy, because it forces them to face the uncomfortable truth that their system isn't as strong as they pretend. You didn't slip past them. You forced them to look at how thin the walls really are, and that's the kind of warfare they hate most. Not the kind fought with weapons, but the kind fought with ideas so sharp they cut through the fabric of authority itself. You didn't weaken their system by breaking it. You weakened it by showing how easily it was already breaking on its own. Number 8, every accusation against you doubled as a confession about them. Every accusation against you doubled as a confession about them. That's the twisted beauty of projection. People reveal the most about themselves when they're trying hardest to hide. In their rush to brand you as dangerous, deceptive, or manipulative, they weren't really exposing your moves. They were exposing their own. The words they chose, the scenarios they imagined, the charges they clung to all came from the lives they were already living. They couldn't see that in trying to paint you as the villain, they were sketching self-portraits in the process. Their language betrayed them at every turn. When they called you a liar, it wasn't because they caught you lying. It was because lying was their daily bread. When they accused you of manipulation, it wasn't a reflection of your tactics. It was a confession of their own methods. When they framed you as someone dangerous to society, what they really meant was dangerous to their control. They had to project their guilt outward because carrying it inward would have destroyed them. That's the irony. They thought they were unmasking you, when in fact they were stripping themselves bare. Every accusation was a mirror they accidentally held up to their own faces. And while they thought they were documenting evidence against you, what they were really building was a catalogue of their own corruption, fear, and deceit. The record doesn't show your guilt. It shows their obsession with disguising their own. This is why their words will never hold the weight they think they do. Because history has a cruel way of turning accusations around and asking, what does this reveal about the accuser? And in their case, the answer is damning. They unintentionally testified against themselves, revealing more in their paranoia than you ever had to say. The brilliance of it all is that you didn't have to fight their claims, you just let them speak. The more they tried to define you, the more they revealed who they were. They thought they were closing in on your secrets, but what they really did was leave behind a trail of their own. And once those words are out, there's no taking them back. Their accusations weren't just noise. They were confessions written in disguise, proof that the real story was never about you at all. Number 9, You weren't the story, you were the mirror that made them hate what they saw. You weren't the story, you were the mirror that made them hate what they saw. That was the real wound, deeper than anything you could have done with force or defiance. You didn't need to perform tricks or hide behind shadows, you simply stood as a reflection they couldn't escape. Every time they tried to unravel you, every time they dug into your actions or dissected your decisions, they kept stumbling onto themselves. And the more they searched for dirt on you, the more their own filth surfaced in the process. This is why their obsession with you grew so frantic. It wasn't that you were impossible to understand. It was that understanding you forced them to confront truths about themselves they'd spent years burying. You were proof that their systems weren't as righteous as they claimed, that their authority wasn't as absolute as they pretended, and that beneath their polished surfaces lay incompetence, greed, and moral rot. They didn't hate you because of who you were. They hated you because you showed them who they were. Their investigations weren't really about gathering facts on you. They became a spotlight on their hypocrisy. Every attempt to expose you revealed another crack in their integrity. Every so-called strategy unraveled into proof of how shallow, self-serving, and corrupt their foundation had always been. And the bitter truth is, the more they studied you, the more they documented their own failure. Your presence didn't weaken them. It revealed how weak they already were. That's what made you dangerous in their eyes. Not that you committed some grand offense, but that you could stand there without collapsing under the same weight that crushed them. You didn't play by their rules, yet you didn't fall apart without them either. That contrast burned them alive. It forced them to face their incompetence, their greed, their inability to act with integrity, and no badge, no title, no system of control could protect them from that reflection. You never asked to be their mirror, but that's what you became. And mirrors don't lie. The story was never yours to tell. It was theirs, and it was ugly. All you did was stand still while they destroyed themselves with the sight of their own reflection. Number 10, they called it psychological warfare, but it was simply you living without fear while they lived in it. They called it psychological warfare, but it was simply you living without fear while they lived in it. That's the core of why they couldn't stand you. To them, control is everything. Control of the narrative, control of people's choices, control of the environment, but you slipped outside of that grip. You existed without bowing to their rules, without trembling at their threats, without being bent by their systems. That wasn't an attack on them, but it felt like one, because in their world, anyone who refuses to be afraid becomes the most dangerous figure in the room. Fear is the fuel they run on. It keeps people compliant, predictable, and easy to herd. Most never question it, because fear is disguised as order, as safety, as authority. But you didn't play along, you lived without it, and in doing so, you proved that fear was never necessary to begin with. That single fact shook them harder than anything else, because if one person can live free of it, then others can too. And if others can too, their entire foundation begins to crumble. What they labeled warfare was really exposure. You exposed how fragile their power is when stripped of fear. You didn't march with weapons, you didn't demand chaos. You just refused to kneel where they expected you to. And every time you stood unshaken, it chipped away at the illusion they worked so hard to maintain. They weren't afraid of what you might do. They were afraid of what you represented, the possibility of living without their leash. That's why bullets, prisons, or punishments will never compare to the threat of fearlessness. Violence can be met with violence, crime can be prosecuted, but fearlessness is untouchable because it exists inside the mind, immune to chains and handcuffs. When you walked into rooms unafraid, you stripped them of their greatest weapon without even trying. And nothing unsettles those in power more than watching their tools fail in real time. You never waged war against them. You just lived in a way they couldn't control. And for people whose authority depends on fear, nothing is more terrifying than someone who refuses to bow to it. That alone was enough to shake their empire to its core. Number 11, you proved that control is not taken, it's surrendered by those who panic first. You proved that control is not taken, it's surrendered by those who panic first. That truth cut deeper than anything else because it showed them that power isn't about who has the loudest voice, the biggest title, or the strongest army. Power is about composure. It belongs to the one who stays steady when everyone else starts unraveling. You didn't need to storm in and seize it. They handed it over the moment they let fear guide their reactions. That's how you beat them without lifting a hand. Panic makes people sloppy. It makes them reveal secrets they swore to keep, rush into decisions that destroy their strategy, and betray their allies just to feel safe for a second. And the moment they moved like that, you didn't even have to act. Their own desperation dismantled them piece by piece. They thought you were pulling strings, but the truth is, they were undoing themselves, giving you leverage without you ever asking for it. This is the part most people miss. Control doesn't collapse in one big dramatic scene. It leaks slowly in the little cracks of impulsive choices and hasty moves. They started doubting themselves, second-guessing their instincts, and overreacting to shadows. Each time they did, they surrendered a little more ground. And by the time they realized how far they'd fallen, it was already too late. You didn't have to strip them of power. They stripped themselves the moment they panicked. That's why calmness is such a dangerous weapon. It's not loud, it doesn't draw attention, but it shifts the entire balance. While they were busy scrambling to contain you, you stood still, unshaken. And that contrast made their chaos even more obvious. They looked unstable next to your steadiness, weak next to your restraint. And when people lose their grip like that, everyone watching can see where the real control lies. You didn't win by force. You won because they gave it away, too blinded by fear to realize they were handing you the upper hand. Panic made them fragile, and fragility is the one weakness you never need to attack. It destroys itself. All you had to do was hold your ground while they fell apart under the weight of their own reactions. That was the victory. Number 12. They expected you to break rule. Instead, you broke their reliance on rules. They expected you to break rules. Instead, you broke their reliance on rules. That was the twist they never saw coming. They walked into the game thinking they knew exactly how you would fail. They thought you'd step outside the lines, violate some law, or smash through a boundary because that's what rebels are supposed to do. But you never played into their prediction. You didn't break the rules. You broke the very idea that rules could save them. They built their confidence on structures. They leaned on manuals, guidelines, and protocols like armor, believing that as long as they stayed inside those frameworks, they would always be safe. That's how systems maintain power, by convincing people that structure itself is strength. But you thrived in the space where no structure could hold you. You weren't reckless. You were adaptive. You weren't ruleless. You were fluid. And in that fluidity, their rigidity snapped. Rules work on people who depend on them. But the moment they faced someone who operated outside of that dependency, their playbook turned into dead weight. Every time they tried to corner you, they leaned on a regulation to trap you. And every time you showed that their regulation didn't apply, or worse, didn't matter, they didn't just lose control of the game. They lost faith in the very system they believed made them invincible. That's what terrified them most. You didn't just slip through a loophole here and there. You revealed that rules are fragile, conditional, and powerless against someone who doesn't need them to navigate life. You weren't waiting for instructions, you weren't asking for permission, and you weren't bound by the comfort of structure. And in that freedom, you exposed their weakness. They couldn't think outside the lines they had sworn to live inside. The victory wasn't in breaking laws or tearing down their order. The victory was in showing that order itself isn't absolute. You thrived in ambiguity, a place where no handbook could save them, no procedure could guide them, and no script could tell them how to respond. And the moment they realized that, the foundation of their power cracked. They weren't defeated by you breaking rules. They were defeated by their inability to function without them. Number 13, they thought they were studying you, but you were training them without their consent. They thought they were studying you, but you were training them without their consent. That's the hidden brilliance of the game you played. They sat across from you in interviews, wrote pages of reports, dissected your choices, and believed they were gathering intelligence. What they never realized was that every second of their so-called investigation was shaping them, bending them, and teaching them things they weren't ready to learn. They thought you were the subject, when in reality they were the pupils trapped in a class they never signed up for. Every interrogation was a lesson. The questions they asked revealed more about their fears than about your answers. And each response you gave, measured, controlled, deliberate, wasn't just a reply, it was a nudge. You steered their minds without them noticing, teaching them where their instincts failed, showing them how their reactions betrayed their insecurities. They thought they were testing you, but the real test was theirs, and they failed it over and over again. Every analysis was a mirror. When they dissected your actions, they weren't charting your behavior. They were exposing their own limits. They were forced to realize how little creativity they had, how rigid their methods were, how predictable their strategies looked when compared to your fluidity. They wanted to box you in with definitions, but every attempt at labeling you ended up labeling themselves instead. You didn't need to correct them. Their own conclusions were lessons disguised as failure. Every file was a curriculum. Page after page meant to capture you turned into documents cataloging their blind spots. They thought they were mapping your moves, but all they were doing was writing a handbook on their vulnerabilities. You didn't hand them this curriculum directly, you let them build it themselves. And that's why it cut so deep. Lessons forced from the outside can be dismissed. Lessons uncovered from within can't be ignored. In the end, they walked away not with control over you, but with knowledge they never wanted. The knowledge that their system isn't as sharp as they thought, that their instincts aren't as reliable as they believed, and that their power crumbles under scrutiny. You didn't need their consent to teach them. You trained them simply by existing, turning their obsession into an education, and the subject of every lesson was their own weakness. Number 14. The ultimate crime you committed was making them realize how predictable they are. The ultimate crime you committed was making them realize how predictable they are. That's the one truth they could never accept. That all their strategies, threats, and reactions weren't born out of brilliance or originality, but out of habit. They believed themselves to be complex, calculating, and untouchable, but you peeled back the mask and revealed the routine underneath. Every move they made, every accusation they threw, every unexpected response was already scripted long before they acted. And once you showed them that, their sense of superiority collapsed. It wasn't theft, violence, or chaos that unsettled them. It was exposure. You didn't steal from them, you revealed them. You didn't strike them with force, you struck them with clarity. Your weapon wasn't a threat, it was a mirror that showed their patterns repeating on a loop. They thought they were adapting to you, but they were just playing the same hand with different words. You knew it before they even moved, and that knowledge gave you control before the game even started. People in power depend on unpredictability to maintain fear. They want to appear as though their responses are impossible to anticipate, that they hold infinite options and hidden strategies. But when you showed them how mechanical they really are, the illusion shattered. The truth was simple. Their power wasn't in being unpredictable, it was in people believing they were. And once you proved otherwise, they lost their grip on the image that kept them untouchable. That's why your crime was so unforgivable. You didn't just win against them, you revealed that their victories were never earned through genius, only through repetition. They were systems on autopilot, running programs they didn't even question. You didn't just predict them, you exposed that they could always be predicted. And that is a humiliation they can't erase. Your greatest weapon wasn't chaos, it was precision. You turned their so-called power into a script, their threats into recycled lines, their confidence into a laughable routine. And once they saw it, they couldn't unsee it. You didn't destroy them with noise, you destroyed them with the quiet truth that they had never been in control at all. They had only been repeating the same play, waiting for someone like you to finally call it out. You never needed to break the system, you only needed to reveal it. Every move, every silence, every word, every reflection was less about domination and more about exposure. You showed them that the strongest institutions crumble not because of outside force, but because of the fear, corruption, and predictability rotting them from the inside. They weren't chasing you, they were chasing their own shadows. They weren't unmasking you, they were confessing themselves. And all the while you stood steady, untouchable, never needing to fight the way they expected, because the real war was already won in their own minds. What they called psychological warfare was simply your refusal to bow to fear. What they called manipulation was precision. What they thought was investigation was education. And they were the unwilling students, learning their fragility lesson by lesson. You weren't the story. You were the mirror. You weren't the criminal. You were the reminder that their power was never as absolute as they wanted the world to believe. And that's why you unsettled them so deeply. Because in the end, you didn't just expose their weaknesses. You exposed a truth far greater. Control is never seized, it's surrendered. Fear is not enforced, it's chosen. And power is not in rules, weapons, or titles, but in the mind that refuses to be broken. That was your crime. That was your brilliance. That was your victory. If this message struck a chord with you, don't just leave it here. Take it further. Hit that subscribe button so you never miss the next drop. Smash the like, share this with someone who needs to hear it, and drop a comment below with your thoughts. I want to hear how this resonated with you. Every bit of support helps this channel grow and keeps these kinds of truths reaching more people. Let's build this community together. Subscribe, like, comment, and share. Your voice matters here. Stay blessed always.